Hey there. So, I wanted to do a ramble about the Battlefield 6 beta, just giving my thoughts on it because I was having a fun time playing it. I wanted to talk about it anyway. It would make a good ramble, so it's just kind of a win-win-win. I'm going to be having gameplay in the background of this video rather than just recording myself. I just felt like doing it. So yeah, we're just mixing up the formula a little bit, but it's still just a ramble. I'm not going to have the gameplay volume on at all. So, you should still be able to use this as ASMR. So I'm gonna be breaking this video down into kind of the good, the neutral, and then the bad, as I saw it. Of course, this is going to be my opinion. You might not agree with everything I say. That's perfectly fine. But this is just what I thought of the beta. Also, again, yes, this is a beta, so a lot of things are subject to change. I'm making this video pretty late, honestly. I meant to make this a bit sooner than I ended up doing it. And there's already been some announcements about certain things that are going to be changing. So maybe I'll comment on those towards the end of the video. But anyway, let's just get started. Like I said, I'm going to structure this into the good, the neutral, and the bad. I'll maybe have timestamps in the description, so it'll be chapters in the video, so you can skip to whatever you want. But we're going to start with the good. Obviously, the biggest thing up front is just the atmosphere of the game is back in a big way. It reminds me a lot of Battlefield 5, which I consider to be potentially the most atmospheric of all of the Battlefield games. I know a lot of people will say that Battlefield 1 is the most immersive, the most atmospheric, but I think atmosphere goes beyond just purely visual presentation. I think it also incorporates certain gameplay elements, and I just personally find that Battlefield 5 has more compelling gameplay features than Battlefield 1. So I've always personally considered Battlefield 5 to be more atmospheric than Battlefield 1. And Battlefield 6, at least with the beta, was very atmospheric. It, like I said, it very much reminded me of Battlefield 5 in that regard. The visuals are really, really good. It's actually funny. I always thought that Battlefield 5 was a pretty good-looking game, and I mean, it absolutely is. But after playing the beta and then going back to Battlefield 5, just because, I have to play something in the meantime, it's crazy how something that you thought looked really impressive can suddenly look really not very impressive after you've played a game which is very much more impressive. The visuals of Battlefield 6 were very impressive, and they certainly added to that feeling of atmosphere. The fidelity of destruction, that sort of thing, where when buildings come down, there's so much dust, there's so many small particles like bricks and things. They get it perfectly right in terms of the scale, I would say. I really can't say enough good things about it. It was really great in that way. Sound design, same thing there. The sound design was really great. I was playing with my brother, and he also talked about how he loved the sound design, particularly when shots are landing near you but they aren't hitting you. You get that supersonic crack from the bullet and those ricochet sounds nearby. It just sounds so crazy. Really adds to that sense of being in a chaotic environment. That's really good. And a lot of that was missing from 2042. 2042 had very little destruction. I feel like the sound design of 2042 was also lacking, at least in some regards. There are some sounds in 2042 that I think are incredibly impressive. Suffice to say that the visual presentation of 2042 was quite a bit lacking, and I think there's quite a few reasons for that. Obviously, they went to 128 players with 2042, so things had to be a lot more optimized in order to run well. And 2042 also supported older consoles, the Xbox One and PS4 era of consoles, so they were going to be more hardware limited with that. Battlefield 6 is back to 64 players, and as far as I can tell, they're not supporting older consoles at this point, so they were a lot less limited in that regard. So the atmosphere of the game is back, and I like that a lot. Also, just generally, the art direction of the game is really nice. Again, this is something that probably is going to be subject to change when the game actually releases. There have been some leaks of, the different soldier skins that are going to be in the game, and a lot of them look very good. But we have yet to see at this point what the battle pass will have. And, if we're talking like months down the line, the types of skins that they'll add to the game, they might start to venture a little bit further from the established art style, which would be a shame in my opinion, but only time will tell. As of right now, though, and as of in the beta, art direction was really cool. All of the soldiers looked very cool, in my opinion. And just not even just the characters, but weapon models were a much higher quality than they were in 2042. I would still say they were a bit behind the curve in terms of just sheer detail, as compared to like Call of Duty, for instance. I've said before about how Call of Duty, specifically the people, the artists working at Infinity Ward, are potentially the best of the best when it comes to like first-person shooters. I really do think that the assets that they create, the animations, the models, the textures, those sorts of things are just in terms of raw detail are pretty much the best of the best. I will say, however, what Battlefield and what the artists working at Battlefield, what they lack in their ability to, and honestly, this probably has nothing to do with like just sheer talent, right? But more just to do with directed limitations, right? Battlefield's a much bigger scale game than Call of Duty, so they probably had greater limitations on poly count for their weapon models and that sort of thing. But regardless, what Battlefield lacks in just sheer detail when it comes to like the poly count of the weapons and that sort of thing, I would say that they actually do make up for with the fact that the weapons that they are depicting in the game are a much more true one-to-one representation of the weapons that they're based on in real life. Often in Call of Duty, they'll sometimes significantly change the look of a weapon. I don't know that this really has anything to do with licensing. Obviously, many of these first-person shooters today don't get licensing from the companies that make these guns just to save money. Battlefield's the same way, and they depict their guns much more true to the real life counterpart. So I don't think it has anything to do with licensing. I think it's just a stylistic choice that Call of Duty modifies the look of the weapons much more. And just personally, I do like the fact that Battlefield depicts them in a much more realistic manner. In kind of the same vein, while we're on the topic of the weapon art and that sort of thing, the weapon customization was another thing that I was a big fan of, and honestly, it just left me wanting more, because I know for a fact that from the leaks, the beta contained a very small fraction, well, maybe not a very small fraction, but a fraction of the total number of weapon attachments that are going to be available in the final game. And I really liked the weapon customization system. I liked how it looked. I liked the freedom that it allowed. It was super cool to be able to pair, the hybrid. You could create your own hybrid optics, which was really cool. Coming from a game like Call of Duty with the gunsmith, where there's a ton of optic choices, and some of them are hybrid choices. But if you want to use a hybrid, you have to use the option that they've pre-created for you, versus in Battlefield, where you choose the high power scope that you want, and then you can pair it with canted iron sights or canted red dot. I just think that's really cool. I'd love to see a magnifier be an option for the optic accessory, so that you could make hybrid optics that work in that way. There hasn't been any sort of indication that that's going to be in the game. I understand that that's going to be harder for them to achieve than doing what they're doing, where you can, pair a magnified optic with a canted red dot. But it's still just something that's on my personal wish list. I'd love to see that. Either way, it's really cool to see what they've done with the weapon customization system, and it'll be really fun to play with it once we have all of the weapon accessories to play with that are planned for the full release. It's also nice to see with Battlefield they actually provide you with true 1x optic choices. In Call of Duty, even the low power, 1x, in quotation marks, 1x red dots are magnified to some small degree. They're more like 1.1 or like maybe 1.2 or something, 1.2x. because you can see it because your FOV is going to shrink in a little bit, versus in Battlefield, the 1x optics are truly 1x. When you aim down sight, your FOV doesn't get any smaller at all. And in the same way, the hybrid optics in Battlefield actually worked like hybrid optics, where you have your magnified optic, and then your 1x, your canted red dot or your canted iron sights are actually truly 1x. Something that's been a common bug, and I've reported this to Activision, but it's never been changed, unfortunately, is that a lot of the hybrid optics in those games, the magnified and unmagnified, options, you have a sight with a magnifier, let's say. The magnified version is, let's say it's 4x, right? And then you switch it off, you go to the unmagnified version, and it's still like 3.9x. It's like the difference in magnification between the two options is incredibly minimal. Some of them do clearly work as intended, and some of them do not, which is how I know it's a bug. But for some reason, they've never fixed it. And so a lot of the hybrid optic choices in Call of Duty just don't work, and therefore are completely useless. So it's nice to see with Battlefield, the hybrid optic choices are actually functional and serve a purpose. And it was just fun to use them. I will say, while we're on the topic of the weapon customization, the one thing that I was really not a fan of at all was the reticles of the optics are really, really bad. Some of the worst I've seen in any game. This should be a very, very simple fix. To just make them look illuminated. They look etched. They look like they're just painted on the glass. They're not illuminated at all. Like I said, changing that to make it appear as though they are illuminated, as though they are how they would actually look in real life, shouldn't be a big issue. Hopefully that's something that they change, but my hopes are not particularly high in that regard, because the optics were fairly similar in 2042. So, I don't know. We'll see. Apparently, Battlefield 4 had a setting in the options menu to adjust the glow of the reticle. So maybe they could add something like that to this game that allows you to have control over it so everybody gets what they want. I would be fine with that as long as it's possible to achieve a result that looks much truer to real life. All right, let's talk about the maps. I really enjoyed the maps. Not only were they visually distinct, which is always a nice thing because you never want your maps to be very monotonous, right? I prefer when the maps feel like they all take place in a different location. Although from what I've seen regarding the leaks and the information we have for the release, it looks like there's going to be like 2 maps for each particular location, which honestly is not a big deal to me. But the variance that we have is good, in my opinion. I think that's a good thing. They were very detailed, which was also nice because that was a big problem I had with 2042, where the maps in 2042, like I said, probably as a means to support the 128 players and the older generation consoles, they were very barren. That was one of the biggest complaints with the map design in 2042, was that there was very little cover. But on top of that, just in terms of like the immersion, the atmosphere, the reasonability of any location, the maps in 2042 were very sterile. They were very empty, very, very clean. There was like almost nothing out of place, especially at launch. They did end up overhauling most, if not all, of the maps and improved them to some degree. But even to this day, I feel like the maps in 2042 are just too clean. They're too plain. Battlefield 6's maps were the complete opposite. There's so many details. There's so much clutter. And so much of it is like destructible. So much of it is interactable. And it just leads to these situations where when a fight breaks out in a location, the location looks and flows very differently at the start of the fight than it does at the end of the fight, and that was really, really good to see. I enjoyed that a lot. I would also say the maps are really well laid out in such a way that they support a pretty wide variety of playstyles, I would say. Obviously, a lot of people have been talking, and we'll get to this later, but a lot of people have been talking about how the maps felt very small and more close quarters focused, and obviously I would agree that a bulk of the maps that we played was more close quarters focused. But even on those maps, there was always at least one area. So like on Iberian Offensive, around the bottom, the south side of the map, towards the E flag, There was a pretty long sightline there. It pretty much from that whole lane from E to A was pretty open and allowed for weapons like the DMR to really shine in those areas. So I thought the maps were very well designed in that way, that like if you wanted to play with a specific weapon or play with a specific play style, despite the maps being catered more to a particular play style, there was always at least like one location on the map. There was one area where you could play in that area, and you know the game was catering to you. There was a place for you to shine with that particular play style, which I think is pretty impressive, honestly, that they were able to kind of in a way make the maps cater to every type of play style simultaneously, which is not a particularly easy thing to do. Now, again, like I said, a bulk of these maps were CQB oriented, but we already know that bigger maps are coming, so it's not really a big issue. I just wanted to point out that the maps felt very versatile in that way. Now let's talk about time to kill. The time to kill was perfect. It was perfect. They made some announcements early on before the beta talking about how they would potentially slow the TTK down, because this was after the initial like streamer event where, you know, they revealed the multiplayer and they had a bunch of streamers play the game live. There was a lot of feedback after that particular play session that the time to kill and time to death felt weird. And so there was talk about them potentially slowing down the time to kill to fix that a little bit. But they didn't do that for either of the two beta weekends. And as far as I can tell right now, they haven't changed it and don't plan to change it for the launch of the game, which is something I was really worried about because the time to kill felt so perfect in the beta. You ever just play a game and it feels like it was just made for you? Like, obviously I'm not narcissistic enough to actually believe that like they watch my videos or specifically made the game for me. But sometimes you just play a game and it's like, this was perfectly crafted for me. Like every single gameplay element of this game was made for me specifically. And that was with the TTK specifically. I felt that a lot with this game, with this beta. It was incredible. It's very fast up close, and I've seen a lot of people saying it's too fast. I just disagree entirely. I love fast time to kill games, but there's a sweet spot because I don't like when games have guns that are like all one shot to kill, right? You know, like really hardcore experiences like Insurgency Sandstorm, that sort of game. I'm really not a big fan of that. So I want the game to be fast, but I still want there to be, you know, a little bit of, you know, the need to land multiple shots. I think those things are both important. I've talked in many a ramble about how I feel about slow time to kill versus fast time to kill. I much prefer fast time to kill, and this game has that. But again, it really only has that up close. At a distance, as you start to extend the ranges in Battlefield 6, the TTK slows way down, and I actually liked that a lot. One of the big problems I had with 2042 was that I felt like I was dying from anywhere on the map, and that was, exasperated by the fact that those maps in 2042 had very little cover. So at any moment you were, vulnerable to a bunch of angles, which just isn't really a problem in Battlefield 6, at least on the maps that we played on. But on top of that, in 2042, there was very little spread, and the time to kill at a distance just seemed really fast, which just to me was not very fun. Battlefield 6 is like the perfect balance to me, where the time to kill is extremely fast up close, which is going to be most of your combat encounters, because in any first-person shooter, most of the gunfights take place within 20 meters or so. But when you do get into that fight at a distance, you're going to have more time to react. You're going to have a chance to dip behind cover, that sort of thing. And importantly, that also gives different weapon categories a chance to shine. Whereas in 2042, the DMRs in that game are completely useless. In Battlefield 6, the DMRs are ridiculously powerful if you can use them at range. We're going to talk about that later, but suffice to say, the time to kill felt perfect. I really, really hope that they don't change the time to kill. I really hope they keep it where it is. I know that this is a very selfish request because this is something that I've been seeing a lot of other people complain about. They think it's too fast. I'm just not in agreement on that. I really, really want them to keep it where it is. And like I said, as far as I can tell, it looks like they're going to be keeping it the same, at least for the launch. They might end up changing it soon after, who knows. They can really do anything at any time, but I really do hope that they keep it the same because it felt so good. In the same way, I would say that the movement and the control of my character felt really good. Honestly, quite a bit better than in other Battlefield games. I feel like Battlefield, and this is just my personal opinion, but Battlefield has always felt a little bit clunkier than like Call of Duty, for instance. I feel like in Call of Duty, you're just like 100% in control of your character. And I feel like that probably has a big part to play in how popular Call of Duty became. In Battlefield, I've always felt like there's a little bit more momentum. There's a little bit more like a resistance for your character to do the things that you're requesting them to do. There's almost a little bit more of like a delay. It's just always felt a little bit clunkier to me. And Battlefield 6, while still, again, I would say it was a little bit clunkier, a little bit more delayed, there was a little bit more momentum than in a game like Call of Duty. It felt significantly reduced from the previous games, and it felt like it was honestly in a really good spot where, I actually ended up liking the amount of momentum that was there because it made me feel a little bit more grounded, like I was actually there in the game. It was a little bit more immersive, but it was still fluid enough that it felt responsive. It felt like I was in control, which was a really good thing, and a vast improvement, like I said, over the previous entries in the franchise. So I was happy to see that. And last but not least, in what I'm calling the good category, certainly not least, because this might be the best thing that they've ever added. I know everybody's been talking about it. I'm not the first, I won't be the last, but the drag revive feature is insane. It's insane. It's one of those things that's like, how was this not always in the game? And on top of that, this is Battlefield, right? Battlefield as a franchise is plagued with bugginess. I mean, say what you will, a big part of why Call of Duty has always beat Battlefield, in my opinion, probably has to do with the fact that Battlefield is just so unbelievably buggy, especially at launches. Obviously, we have yet to see, maybe when they give us the final build, there's just going to be so much stuff in it that it's just going to break. Who knows what's going to happen with that? So I could end up eating my words on this one, but in the beta, it worked so well. It's one of those things where it's like you can imagine so many problems arising with this feature. Like, oh yeah, it's simple. You just give players the ability to drag down down teammates, but it's like, what happens if the person dragging you gets killed? Does your body get reset to where it was? Or like, what happens if, you get revived really far away from where you died? Is there going to be complications with it? It's like, no, it just worked exactly like you would want. It was literally perfect. It's one of those gameplay features, those gameplay additions that is great for both like the realism and like the immersion factor, and also the gameplay. It's the perfect gameplay feature because it helps in both regards. It's so incredibly immersive to grab a guy and drag him like around a corner while bullets are whizzing all around you and explosions are going off. And even from the perspective of the downed person, when you're downed and you start getting dragged to cover, it feels so cool. It's like you're living out a movie scene or something like that. It's so immersive. It's so cool. And then on top of that, like I said, just gameplay-wise, it's so refreshing. One of the biggest problems with past Battlefield games, I mean, it's not really a problem per se, it's just a frustration, really, is when you're playing as a medic, which I often do. I would go so far as to say I'm a support main. I'm a medic main. It's a really good way to like get on the top of the leaderboard in every game because revives are worth a lot of points. But it's always been frustrating to try to revive someone that's in a bad location and then die because of that, right? Especially if they're like just barely in a bad location, like they're just right around a corner where an enemy's looking, and it's like, if I could just drag them like an inch away from where they are, I'd be fine. And in this game, in Battlefield 6, you can actually do that. You can just grab them and drag them behind cover. It's so cool. I didn't really notice any moments either, which this is also pretty impressive, I would say. One of the big complications that you potentially make with the drag revive feature is that you make it very frustrating to play against, right? Where it's like when I kill someone and then I see their body get dragged away and there's nothing I can do about it, like that would be very frustrating. But I really didn't notice that happening at all, at least in the gameplay that I had when I was playing the beta. I mean, I would see people get drag revived, but it never felt like I was getting cheated, right? Like there was nothing I could do about it. It just felt good. It's a purely good addition to the game. And whoever came up with that, the engineers, the programmers that made it happen, they should be very proud of themselves because that's a great feature. On top of it just working really well, it also just looks really, really good. The animations for it look really solid. And the way, like, when you're the downed person, the way your legs and like your body flow over the ground as you get dragged looks really good, like surprisingly good, to the point where I'm like, again, how did they just get it so perfect on the first try? Like, this is the first time they've tried to do a feature like this, and it's perfect, it's flawless. Like, I'm just baffled by how good it is. So really great job with that one. Really amazing. All right, so now we're going to start getting into what I consider to be the neutral aspects of the game, the neutral aspects of the beta that I experienced. These are the things that I don't necessarily consider good. I don't consider them bad. I think maybe they just need a little bit of tuning to make them good or to make them perfect or whatever. But anyway, we're going to start with the weapon balance. And I'm going to be talking less about, like, damage and time to kill and that sort of thing. Obviously, the M4 was very powerful. The shotgun was very powerful. Although, if I'm being honest, I personally don't think that the shotgun was overpowered. A lot of people have been talking about how they think the shotgun's overpowered. I really don't think so, but we'll get to that later. I'm going to be talking about the spread and certain other gunplay mechanics that could influence the weapon balance. The first thing with weapon spread, I'm perfectly fine with weapon spread. In fact, I would say I actually really like the idea of spread as a means to control engagement distances with certain weapon categories. I think it allows certain weapon categories to actually have a place, and it gives the developers a lot more control over at what ranges certain weapons are actually, like, good and powerful. That being said, I do feel the way that the weapons were tuned in regards to spread was a little weird. The SMGs in particular had very little spread, to the point where you could just full auto beam people from pretty far away. Now, obviously, you're going to be dealing with a much slower time to kill because your raw damage output at significant ranges with SMGs is quite low. So maybe that was their thinking, was that because the damage is so much lower with SMGs, they need less spread. But just intuitively, it felt a little weird for the SMGs to be, like, laser accurate at range, but then, like, assault rifles and LMGs had a lot of spread. So yeah, I would say that the SMGs probably just needed a little bit more spread to make that feel more ideal. Other than that, like I said, I have no problem with the spread. In terms of the amount of spread, I didn't really have any problems with that either. Some people have been saying that it feels like there's too much spread. And obviously, if you're coming from a game like Call of Duty that has absolutely no spread, that's just not a mechanic in those games, it'll obviously feel kind of weird to have, like, basically hip fire accuracy while you're aiming down sights. But honestly, that's just something that you'll get used to after a while. And I thought it was good in the beta. So yeah. I just think that the weapon categories should be tuned to be a bit more intuitive, I guess. If SMGs are going to be good up close, then they should probably have more spread at range that makes them less effective at that range. That's just my thoughts there. Something else is snipers need more flinch. I've seen a lot of people talking about how suppression should affect sniper accuracy, and honestly, I'd be fine with that too. But there were plenty of moments where I wasn't just suppressing a sniper. I was literally hitting them with bullets. But because the time to kill, like I said, the time to kill at range is pretty slow in this game, even when you're landing your shots, which is harder to do at range because of things like spread, right? But even when I was hitting snipers directly, they were still able to headshot me because there's just so little flinch. So there definitely needs to be more flinch. And like I said, I would be okay with there being more sniper inaccuracy when they are being suppressed. I don't think that would too negatively affect the game. That was very annoying to have very little counterplay. against snipers when you were using a weapon like an assault rifle or an LMG, which again, I'm not against the idea of weapon categories being good at specific ranges, right? Obviously, a sniper should be better at an LMG when it comes to extremely long range, but it just felt weird to have basically no productive means to, counter that player whatsoever. So I would like to see a bit of an adjustment there. And then the final thing I have here is the sweet spot is back. The sweet spot being from Battlefield 1, where the bolt-action rifles can get a one-shot kill to the chest, not just the head, at a specific range. And this is a gameplay mechanic that I'm a bit torn on. I see it both ways. I understand that it is satisfying to, get those one-shot kills, so making them easier to get is, more accessible. It makes the game a little bit more casual. It makes the game more appealing to a broader audience, and those are all good things. I do want this game to succeed. But I can't help but feel like it's just a little bit more annoying to get killed by the sweet spot, because it happened quite a bit. There were quite a few times when I was playing where I would get killed from one shot, full health, and it wasn't a headshot, so it had to be the sweet spot. And it's just like, man, if I had been like 1 foot back or 1 foot forward or whatever, the ranges are, it's just like, it's just a little bit annoying. I can't deny that it's a little bit annoying. As a person that also doesn't really snipe that much, I leveled up all of the weapons in the beta to the max level, except for the sniper rifle, because I just don't snipe. I'm just not particularly good at it. So as a person that doesn't snipe that much, I have to admit that, them getting rid of the sweet spot wouldn't affect me at all, but it was just a little bit annoying. So I don't know. Like I said, I see that one kind of both ways, but it is what it is. All right, let's talk about the game modes. This was long before any information came out regarding Battlefield 6. This was one of the things that I talked about how I really want them to innovate with the game modes. And unfortunately, we didn't see anything new in the beta. Now, apparently there are some new modes planned for the full release, so only time will tell if those are actually good. There's a new mode called Escalation, which actually kind of sounds similar to the game mode that I proposed in some of my videos, where you have one squad versus one squad, and then eventually they all coalesce into one big team versus team fight. I forget what videos I've talked about that in, but the escalation mode doesn't sound exactly the same, but it sounds vaguely similar. So I'm a bit curious to see how that one's going to play out. But I was a bit bummed with the beta to not see any new modes whatsoever. Conquest played quite well, I would say. It was pretty fun. I would say Conquest was probably my favorite mode of the beta. But it's Conquest, I've played it 100 million times. I wanted something new. Now, when it comes to the balance of the game modes, and this is where, we get a bit more into the bad territory. This is like neutral minus, if you will. Certain game modes just seemed pretty poorly considered, pretty poorly balanced. So Breakthrough on Liberation Peak was very challenging for attackers. For defenders, it was, a breeze most of the time. And I am actually a little torn on this because obviously I don't think it should be easy for either team, right? You don't want to make it easy for attack, but I do think that it is a little too hard for attack at the moment. I think one of the easiest ways that they could make this better, make it more balanced, is just to increase the capture zone for the first sector on Liberation Peak, whatever it's called, I forget. Just because that first sector is so hard to get past. I will say, though, with how hard it was for attack, it was extremely satisfying when you would win as attack. So it's a bit of give and take, because in those rare moments when you would win, it was really, really good feeling. It was very satisfying because you knew that you had worked really hard for it. And there were some games that were just like, you bulldozed the enemy team in either direction, whether you were attack or defense. And honestly, that I feel like that started happening a lot more in the second week of the beta. I'm not exactly sure why that would have been, but I did notice that, landslide victories were becoming a bit more common in the second weekend, which is a bit strange. But either way, the game is at its best, and this goes for every game ever made. Every game is at its best when both teams are comprised of competent players that have an equal chance of winning, right? It's not really all that fun to just bulldoze an enemy team, and it's certainly not fun to get bulldozed by an enemy team. And it just felt like with certain game modes, with Rush, with Breakthrough, that was a bit more common, which was a bit of a shame. So I think that'll need a bit of tweaking. I will say on Liberation Peak, the final sector of Breakthrough is really, really fun. And it's unfortunate that the first sector was so hard because you very rarely ever got to play the final sector. But that final sector where you're pushing up the hill, or if you're the defender, you're defending the hill, is a lot of fun. It's just very stylistically and like visually satisfying, to make that final push up the hill. But then also gameplay wise, I feel like that particular sector was well balanced. It's really just that first sector that is the problem, honestly. The next point I've got here is in regard to the spawning mechanics. So with Battlefield 1 and Battlefield 5, they used a real-time map for the spawning. I think this was more of a stylistic choice because those games are historical. Battlefield 1 was World War I and Battlefield 5 was World War II. In that era, there's no satellite imagery sort of thing, right? So they just went with a real-time overview of the map where you're just zoomed way out. But the thing is that in those games, when you spawned, the camera would zoom in real time to the exact spot on the map that you were spawning into. And it was a pretty seamless transition between being in the overview map and then being spawned into the actual game. And while I never really considered that was a gameplay feature, I found myself a few times when playing Battlefield 6 being a bit disoriented upon spawn, because Battlefield 6 returns to a more traditional spawn screen where the spawn screen is not a real-time representation of the map. It's just like a satellite image. And they do give you like a spawn camera that shows like the point or the player that you're going to spawn on. But I just personally, it's not a huge issue. I didn't notice it every single time I spawned, but just a few times when I spawned, I found myself being a little bit disoriented about where exactly I was in relation to where, I wanted to be, in relation to like the point that I had chosen to spawn on, that sort of thing. There were just a few times where I just felt a little bit disoriented because there is no seamless transition. It's just all of a sudden you're in the game and it's plopped you down somewhere and you're not exactly sure where it is. So that was just, again, it's more of a neutral thing. That's why I have it in the neutral category. I don't expect them to change this at all, but that was just something that I noticed that was a little bit unfortunate, at least for me. Another small nitpick I have is that it was hard to tell when you were crouched, in my opinion. I don't know if anyone else had this, but personally, there were lots of times, and this is also exasperated by the fact that you can crouch sprint, which I think is a very good thing. I guess I didn't mention that with like the movement, but I do like the plethora of movement abilities in the game. They brought back crouch sprint from Battlefield 5, which I think is a really cool thing to have in the game. But because of that, it means that when you start sprinting, there's no real saying whether or not you're standing or crouched because you can sprint in either configuration. In Battlefield 5, there was a small indicator on the screen that would tell you when you were crouched, and I would like them to add something like that to Battlefield 6. I feel like that would be pretty simple, because there were a few times when I wasn't aware. And again, it's not a huge issue. You can just spam the crouch button a couple times just to see what stance you're in. But just being able to look at the screen and immediately know, I think would be superior. So the narrator callouts. Occasionally, the narrator will sometimes call out information. So one of the things that I heard somewhat frequently was like, there's a sniper to your south or whatever, I don't know if this is truly inaccurate or if it's just, it feels inaccurate, but there were a lot of times when I would get a call out like that. Like, for instance, sniper to your south. And I would look to the south and it's like, there's no possible way that there's a sniper in that direction. Like, I'm on the edge of the map and south is like off the map. So there were times when it felt like that information was just wrong. Again, I'm not 100% sure if it was. Maybe it was just really, really obscure. Just a small nitpick I have where it's like, if you're going to have that sort of information in the game, I feel like it should be accurate. And there was just a few times when it didn't feel like it was always accurate. I'm going to mention proximity chat in the neutral category. Now, there is no precedent going back in the franchise for proximity chat to be in the game. And there was nothing really before the beta or leading up to the beta that suggested that proximity chat was going to be in the game. But that being said, I am bummed that there is no proximity chat in the game. I would really, really like to see proximity voice chat in the game, at least for your team. A team-wide proximity-based voice chat would be great, in my opinion. I'm a bit surprised, honestly, that it isn't, especially after so many games have become wildly successful almost entirely because of their implementation of proximity voice chat. You know, games like Lethal Company, Repo, Peak, and then even if you want to make a more similar comparison with Modern Warfare 2, featured proximity voice chat in their larger modes with, Warzone 2 and DMZ, like I said. People celebrated that. It was incredibly fun to be able to talk to people that weren't in your squad, be able to talk to people that were just near you. It offered so many just pure fun. Like it's really nothing more than just pure fun. So I was a bit disappointed to see that is not a feature in the game. I really, really hope that they add it, at least for the Battle Royale that they have planned. But I would really like to see it even in the regular modes like Conquest and whatnot. I'd really like to see proximity voice chat, especially they have different sound mixes for the voice chat, and one of them is considered in-world, which attempts to pretty much do the things that Lethal Company and Peak do, where, they add reverb to your voice when you're in an echoey area, and it makes it sound like it's playing over a radio when the person you're talking to is pretty far away. They're out of just normal talking range. So those features are cool, but combined with proximity team-based voice chat would be really great. I'd really love to see that. I know this is a bit of a divisive subject, but I'm really bummed that they got rid of vehicle enter-exit animations. I know a lot of people really didn't like them in Battlefield 1 and 5 because they feel very slow, and they made getting in and out of vehicles a bit clunkier, and would often get you killed if you were trying to bail from a vehicle right before it exploded type of thing, But I'm just going to go out there and say that I was a particular fan of them. And I think more importantly than just the immersion that they offer, because you don't just teleport into a vehicle all of a sudden, I think that the enter-exit animations are actually an important balancing feature. Something that I really dislike about Warzone, for instance, is that vehicles in that game are what I would consider overpowered, not because of what they are, but because of the gameplay opportunities that they offer, where you can drive towards a player very quickly and then get out at any point in your drive, and you're just stood there, standing where you got out. That same thing is possible in Battlefield 6, where you can drive very, very fast, and at any point you can get out, and your character is just plopped out, standing there completely still. It just creates a very disorienting experience for anyone that you're going up against, because from their perspective, they have no idea at which point you are going to hop out of the vehicle, or if you even have any plans to do so. And so if they're just tracking the vehicle and you hop out, the vehicle's going to continue on because it has momentum, but you're going to be stood somewhere behind it. I feel like it creates an unimmersive but also imbalanced situation where it's just it's not really skillful, right? You just drove a vehicle towards someone and hopped out, and intuitively the person is going to track the vehicle because that's the threat, and they're probably not going to see you hop out. Battlefield 6 has a roll mechanic where if you drop from a certain height, you can hold the crouch button and you will roll to reduce the damage that you take. I would like to see them implement maybe that animation or something similar to it, so that when you get out of a vehicle that's moving at a certain speed, you will initiate that roll so that you aren't immediately able to start attacking or start shooting or whatever, I would also like to see damage taken from exiting a vehicle that's moving at a certain speed. Now, I get it. A lot of people don't like these sorts of things because they make the game a little less arcadey and a little bit more realistic. But again, this is more of a balancing mechanic, in my opinion, than a realism implementation. Obviously, it does lend itself towards being more realistic, but I don't need it to be a one-to-one representation of what would happen in real life if you get out of a car moving 60 miles an hour, right? I just want there to be some sort of penalty for doing something like that, because it just doesn't feel earned, in my opinion, when you get a kill using that method. I've never liked that in any game, and I'm a bit bummed that Battlefield 6 has gone that direction. I would really like to see them add enter-exit animations for the vehicles so that the player model doesn't just magically disappear or reappear in the world as they get in and out of a vehicle. I think that would create a lot less confusion and a lot less of an opportunity to abuse that system. But I don't have high hopes that that is going to be added, unfortunately. But it's just something that I would like to see. While talking about vehicles, I will say that there was a weird issue that I noticed with the spawning language, if you will, the UI language, which is that, when you're looking at the spawn overview screen, you can spawn on any of the points that your team owns, but you can also spawn on your squad mates, and your squad mates will be surrounded by a green square when they are able to be spawned on. And that square that's around them will turn red when they are in combat so that you can't spawn on them. That's the game, telling the player when they can and can't spawn. That's perfectly fine. But an odd quality that I noticed was that when there's a vehicle that you can spawn on, it's also surrounded by a square. But either way, when that vehicle is damaged, that square turns red to indicate to the player that the vehicle is damaged. So it's like, okay, you can spawn on it, but just know that it's not a full health vehicle. To me, that was very confusing, and there were a lot of moments where I was just looking at the spawn screen, waiting for that square to not be red anymore, because intuitively to me, I associate that red square with the idea that you cannot spawn. But with vehicles, there is no spawning limitation. It's not like a vehicle can be in combat, so you can't spawn on it, right? So it was just confusing to me that they used that same visual language, because there were lots of moments, like I said, where I was waiting for the square to go back to being green, but it wasn't going to, because it was just telling me that the vehicle was damaged and I could still spawn on it. So I think they should change that. Maybe make the square yellow or something to indicate that the vehicle is damaged, or better yet, just have a health bar above the square to show you what health the vehicle is at, because that was another thing. There was no real way to see how much health a vehicle had when you were going to spawn on it. It seems like the red square showed up almost immediately after the vehicle took any amount of damage. So basically the square was green only when the vehicle was at full health. And if it was even at like 99 health, the square would turn red, which just leaves you completely clueless about the state of the vehicle. They could be at 1 health or they could be at 90 health. In both situations, the square is going to be red, so you have no idea. And there were a few times when I would spawn on a vehicle and it would just immediately blow up. So it would be nice to see just like a health bar of the vehicle so that you know what you're getting into, rather than just showing the square as red to letting you know it's damaged to some mysterious degree. I was also a little bummed to see that there aren't staged reloads, at least for most of the weapons, it seems. I think some of the gadgets had staged reloads. Now, if you aren't aware, staged reloads is the idea that there are certain points within the reload animation that it doesn't make sense for it to reset if you interrupt the animation at that point. So, for instance, if you pull the magazine out of a gun and then, you switch weapons because someone shows up or something like that, when you switch back to the weapon that you were reloading in a game without staged reloads, the magazine will be back in the gun, even though your character already took it out. There's pros and cons to doing it either way. With staged reloads, you can't cancel the reload, which is a thing that a lot of players like to do. They like to have the ability to cancel the reload, because if you initiate a reload and then someone comes around the corner and maybe you still have like half of the ammo in your magazine, if you can cancel it really quickly, you might be able to have a better chance of killing that opponent that just randomly showed up than you would in a game that has staged reloads where there is no way to cancel it. But just personally as a player, I prefer games that have staged reloads. I just think it intuitively makes more sense. If I see my guy take the magazine out of the gun, I don't want to switch weapons and then see him have to do it again. It just doesn't make sense. And then for weapons that have like a longer reload time, like LMGs and that sort of thing, staged reloads are just a lot more pleasant, because it means that, if you're reloading an LMG and you make it right to the end of the animation, but something happens and you accidentally cancel the animation, you have to start all the way over, from like a 5-second reload. And it's just very annoying when that happens. So I prefer staged reloads. I'd like for them to be added to the game. Like I said, some of the gadgets did have staged reloads, so possibly it's something that's planned for the full release and just wasn't part of the beta. I'm not sure, but that is something that I would like to see added that wasn't in the beta. The bipods didn't work on inclined surfaces. That was something that was a bit annoying. I noticed this particularly on Liberation Peak around the C objective. When you're on either side of the C objective, I was trying to mount my bipod on the ground, and it really seems reluctant to do anything other than keep you level with like the horizon. So it was almost impossible to like look up far enough with the bipod. So the bipod mechanics are just kind of weak, in my opinion. I think they should be refined a little bit more. Admittedly, that same problem exists in Call of Duty, so maybe this is just kind of an intrinsic problem that bipods in video games have. But yeah, bipods weren't great in the beta, unfortunately. This was a minor problem, but the quit to menu button didn't work sometimes, particularly when you were in between matches. So after the end of one match and as you were loading into the next match, if you tried to quit to menu, it would usually just not work and it would load you into the next match. It wasn't a big deal because then you would just hit quit to menu after you loaded in, and that would usually work the second time. But it's just, it would save you 5 seconds if it didn't do that. Just a minor little nitpick there. And then finally, in the neutral category, we have objective call-out information seemed wrong. I'm almost 100% certain that there was some kind of bug here where, when your team is capturing an objective, the narrator will inform you of what's happening. So say you have, your team is taking E, the narrator will say, our team is taking Echo or whatever. That particular call-out seemed wrong sometimes. So like there were times when my team was taking an objective, specifically when an objective would change to neutral. So in Battlefield, you don't just immediately change from one team to the other. You neutralize an objective first, and then you have to capture it for your team. It seemed like that was bugged, where when an objective would get neutralized, the call out would be wrong. So let's say the enemy has an objective and my team neutralizes it. The narrator would often call out that the objective had been lost from our team, despite the fact that we had neutralized it from the enemy team, actually. So that was just a little weird. It wasn't a big deal because it's pretty easy to tell what's going on without the narrator there. But, I mean, if you're going to have the narrator there, they should be giving you the correct information. So that was just a little weird. All right, and now we're going to start talking about the things that I thought were really bad, the things that were really annoying and had a negative effect on my gameplay experience. The biggest one, I would say, without a doubt, was the inconsistency when it came to deploying gadgets. Specifically, the gadgets that would have like a ghost of where they were going to be when you deployed them. There's like 2 different deploying methods of the gadgets. So, for instance, the support bag, the bag that gives you health and ammo, the character will just throw that out. There is no ghost that shows where it's going to be. You just throw it out and it just lands there. I don't know why that seems to use a different system, but that one works perfectly fine. It was the gadgets that deploy with a ghost. So the deployable cover for the support class, the tugs and the spawn beacon for the recon class, those gadgets, when you would try to deploy them, not only did it just seem a bit arbitrary about where you were and were not allowed to deploy it, where it's like if there was even just slight incline or a little bit of rubble in your way, you would not be able to deploy those things there, which was a little, well, not even just a little, it was quite annoying. But there were lots and lots and lots of times where I would click the button, the ghost is white, which indicates that you are allowed to place it there. And when I would place it, it wouldn't actually show up, but it would reduce it from my inventory. So like with the deployable cover for the support class, I would lose it, but it wouldn't actually show up in the world. And there were lots of instances where it's like, you run out into gunfire and you place that there in the hopes that you can get it down in time. But if it doesn't show up and then you just die, that's really frustrating. And the same thing with like the spawn beacon. If I want to put my spawn beacon somewhere so that I can spawn there in the event that I die, and then it just doesn't show up, then I'm just fucked. And that's really, really frustrating. That happened quite a bit, and that was very annoying. So that's really the most important thing I have in this section. The second thing is defibrillator inconsistency. There were quite a few times when I would try to revive someone as support with the defibrillators rather than dragging them because the defibrillators are a lot faster. So in certain instances, it makes more sense to use them over the dragging. There were plenty of times when the defibrillators just didn't seem to work, where you would have to zap people multiple times and potentially they wouldn't get revived even after like 5 zaps. So in those instances, I would just drag revive them, because that, ironically, despite the fact that defibrillators have been in Battlefield for, decades at this point, it seemed like the drag revive feature was less buggy than the defibrillator, even though the drag revive is completely new. It was just a bit annoying to have to do that in certain situations, so I would like to see them improve that. I'm also going to throw in dual primaries into the bad category. I'm not a big fan of dual primaries for the assault class. I just don't feel like it's necessary at all, and I don't feel like it, really accomplishes much. To me, and obviously I have no way of knowing this, but to me it really feels like they implemented the dual primaries for assault class because they really wanted the assault class to have a dedicated breaching shotgun. In a lot of the promotional material, they show the assault class, blowing open doors with a shotgun, and the default option for the assault class was the shotgun. It was the default gadget that you have as your second primary. So I'm just going out on a limb and assuming that they wanted to give the assault class the ability to have a secondary shotgun that they can use for breaching and that sort of thing. If that truly was their motivation for adding the dual primaries into the game, I much rather would have had them implement like a dedicated gadget that is just a shotgun. So like the Serbu Super Shorty shotgun would have been a good gadget to give the assault class if they wanted him to have the potential to have a dedicated breaching shotgun that doesn't require them to use a shotgun as their primary weapon. I just really I'm not a big fan of the dual primaries, and I think that would have worked out better. It's kind of interesting because there is a shotgun gadget that's planned for the full release for the assault class. It's the M26 mass shotgun. I believe it's going to be like an incendiary, like Dragon's Breath type of shotgun, so I guess it will have its own slightly different utility in that regard. But I'm just not big into the dual primaries. I think there's other solutions to that problem that don't kind of ruin the class structure in the way that dual primaries does. I also feel like dual primaries completely eliminates their ability to add in specific weapons. So as an example, the Serbu Super Shorty, let's say they wanted to add that weapon into the game. It's been in previous Battlefield games, so it seems reasonable to assume that they may at some point want to add it to Battlefield 6, right? As the game is structured right now, I really don't feel like there's any place to add the Serbu Super Shorty that makes sense. Let's say they add it as a primary shotgun, right? Why would anybody ever use that as their primary? Or why would any assault ever use it as their second primary when they could just use any of the other regular sized shotguns, right? So you can't make it a primary because it's clearly outclassed by the other primary shotguns. So then you think, okay, let's make it a secondary. It takes the place of a pistol. But then if you do that, then you're basically giving every class the ability to be assault. You really drastically reduce the significance of giving assault dual primaries when suddenly every class can basically have dual primaries. So you can't make it a secondary weapon. So then you think, okay, let's just make it a gadget. But then again, why would assault, if you're going to make the Serbu Super Shorty its own isolated gadget for the assault class, why would assault use that over any of the primary shotguns? It doesn't make any sense. So I just feel like dual primaries causes a lot of problems when it comes to the implementation of certain kind of like, not necessarily goofy, but just specifically catered weapons, like, weapons that serve a very specific function. I feel like they don't really have a place in the game anymore because of dual primaries. So I would just personally like to see them remove dual primaries, but they probably won't. So it is what it is. This was a fairly minor bug, but the firing range, I was playing on Xbox Series X. The firing range ran at like 30 frames per second, which is really weird because the regular game, when you're actually in game in a match with, 64 players on the real maps, ran flawlessly. I had literally no problems the entire experience when it came to performance. If it ever dropped below 60, I could never tell. It ran perfectly. But the firing range ran at like 30, if not less than 30 frames per second, which was really weird. I imagine that's probably going to be an easy fix. There's probably just something being loaded in that's like taking up all of the hardware or something. I don't know. But that was really weird. And it was a little bit annoying because when you wanted to test your weapons, you couldn't really get a full idea of what it felt like to use them, because playing at 30 frames per second is just significantly worse than playing at 60. Just a small nitpick there. Like I said, I'm a bit of a medic main, a bit of a support main. So as a person that went around reviving people, something that I noticed was that, pinging down to players to tell them that you were on your way so that they wouldn't skip the revive was very inconsistent, very hard to do. Often when I would try to do that, it would just ping like the terrain or some obstacle that was in between me and the downed player. It didn't really like to do it through surfaces, through walls, through the terrain, that sort of thing. So yeah, pinging downed players was very inconsistent, very annoying, because that's a really good way to keep someone from skipping, which is a very annoying thing to have happen as a medic player, is when you run towards a downed player and they skip right as you get there. There's like almost nothing more frustrating than that. So having the ping system work so that they know beforehand that you're on your way is really important, and it just didn't work very well at all in the beta. This is more of a personal thing, but I really, really hate the parachute mechanics. Now, to be fair, there weren't really any, at least none that I noticed significantly. There weren't really many moments in my experience of the beta where the parachute really came into play at all. But that being said, the clips that I've seen and the brief amount of time that I've experienced it myself, the parachute mechanics are dog shit. There's so many problems with them. Okay, first problem being is that when you deploy the parachute, you actually gain height. So like you're falling and you start to gain height when you pull out the parachute. That just makes no sense. Second problem is that it is significantly too fast. It is way too fast. When you're flying through the air, your lateral speed is so high, and the amount of distance that you're dropping vertically is so minimal. You can cover so much ground so quickly. The parachutes are like faster than the cars and the even potentially faster than like the jets and things. It is so fast. I have no idea. Obviously, I imagine they really designed the parachute mechanics around the Battle Royale mode that they have planned. I get it, but I think they need to be changed, even for that mode. And I'm just going to go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that I am not and never have been a big fan of the infinite parachute gameplay mechanic that has become very prevalent in first-person shooters, specifically in regards to battle royales. I mean, Battlefield kind of invented that, if you want to argue, because Battlefield has always had the infinite parachutes gameplay mechanic, which allows the player to avoid fall damage entirely when jumping from pretty much any height. I've just never been into that. I personally think that completely eliminates a lot of the interesting cost-benefit analysis that could happen with a game like this, where being up in a high vantage point is an advantage in and of itself. But in a game where you do not have infinite parachutes, there is a consequence of going up somewhere high in that you have to consider how you're going to get down. And I just personally find that idea of having to consider that as a possibility significantly more interesting than what we have with most modern games these days, which is you go up somewhere high and it's pure advantage because you never have to think about how you're going to get down, because you just always jump off the roof and parachute to safety. I just personally, I think it's significantly more interesting to consider the alternative, which is not giving the player infinite parachutes, or if you are going to give the player a parachute, you give them a single parachute that they must use, to great effect, right? It is significantly more valuable because there is a limit of them. So I've never been a fan of infinite parachutes, and I think the parachute mechanics in Battlefield 6 are really, really bad. I would really like to see them rework them, but again, I really don't think that that's going to happen. And then the final thing I have in the bad category is random damage on spawn. It didn't happen a ton, but occasionally when I would spawn in Battlefield 6, you would just suddenly take like 80 damage. You would be very close to death for like no reason. I'm almost certain that this was a bug. It happened multiple times for literally no reason. I'm spawning in like the HQ. There's no enemies nearby, and there's no like explosion sound. I'm clearly not getting shot by anything. Like there was no hit sound. It's just all of a sudden I'm like down to 20 health. And that was very annoying because that did sometimes lead to me dying in situations where I probably could have survived otherwise if I had had full health like I should have had. Like I said, that's probably just a random bug that they'll work out, hopefully. But I had to mention it because it happened a few times and it was quite annoying. All right, before I close up this video, I just wanted to do a quick section talking about some of the other things I've seen people talking about online, some of the talking points that I've seen pop up more often than not. I just wanted to give my 2 cents on them, just to kind of be a thorough review of the beta. So the first thing that I'm going to be talking about is whether or not the game is too fast-paced. I've seen a lot of people talking about how they feel like the game is too fast-paced, whether or not they think it feels like Call of Duty or it just feels like it's, spawn, die, spawn, die, spawn, die. A lot of people have been saying that the game feels too fast-paced. And to those people, I say you just need to play the game slower. The first few matches I played of Battlefield 6, I did kind of feel that way. I felt like I've talked before about how I kind of despise the modern Call of Duty formula in that it makes me feel like a single cell organism. That's the term I use to describe the gameplay of modern Call of Duty. I feel like a single cell organism that has no capacity to think, and thinking has no effect on the gameplay. I'm just running around aimlessly looking for stimuli. I did kind of feel that way with my first few matches of Battlefield 6, but I very quickly corrected that. By just playing slower, I slowed myself down and I started having a blast. I also started doing significantly better in the game as a whole. Battlefield 6 allows you to play it slowly, and I would go so far as to say that it heavily rewards a slower play style. So if you think the game is too fast-paced, if you think it's spawn, die, if you think there's no time to breathe, if you think there's no time to think in the game, I really think you should just slow yourself down. I really do think that this is a matter of personal issue where, we haven't had a good Battlefield game like this in quite a while. And like I said, a lot of the Call of Duties that have been coming out recently have leaned more and more heavily into that single cell organism gameplay. And I think it's understandable that gamers as a whole have gotten so into that style of gameplay that it's hard to kind of shake yourself from it. But if you can, I think the game does allow you to succeed perfectly fine. I really don't think the game is too fast-paced. And if anything, I think it kind of works out for everybody, because for the people that want it to be fast-paced in that manner, if they want it to play more like Call of Duty in quotation marks, they can play it that way if they want to. And then for players like me who value being able to think, who value being able to position yourself and actually take in your surroundings and factor that into the way you play, the game absolutely allows you to do that. So I completely disagree that the game is too fast-paced. Another thing I've been seeing is people saying the weapons are imbalanced, particularly in regards to shotguns and DMRs. People have been saying the shotguns are OP and the DMRs are useless. I disagree with both to varying degrees. Shotguns, I really don't think the shotguns are OP. I mentioned this earlier, we're going to talk about it now. They're powerful up close, yeah, sure. And the thing is that the maps we played on, like I already stated, the maps were all CQB oriented for the most part. There were lots and lots of areas on these maps where you were forced into very close quarters with your enemy. And in those situations, of course, a shotgun is going to be powerful. So I think the map selection really heavily skewed the perception of how powerful certain weapons were. I did see clips of people using the shotgun out to extended ranges, whether that be with the slug rounds or just a regular buckshot. And still, I just really don't think that the shotguns are significantly overpowered. Maybe they could be tuned back just a little bit, but I really think that it was more just the map selection that made them seem more overpowered than they really were. I will say, though, for what it's worth, the shotgun that we had access to in the beta is a pump-action shotgun. But despite that, it shot very fast, which I think did play into how powerful it felt. It does seem weird that for a pump-action shotgun, it shot as fast as it did. I wouldn't be opposed to them slowing down the RPM on the pump-action shotgun a little bit, but we already know that semi-auto shotguns are going to be in the full release of the game, so arguably that might not even have, a significant effect if those other shotguns are going to be just as, if not potentially even more powerful. So only time will tell about that, but just personally, from my experience, I really didn't think the shotguns were overpowered. I feel like every time I died to a shotgun, it was at a range where I could understand, like, yeah, of course a shotgun's going to blast me away when the barrel is stuffed down my throat. Like, what do you want, right? Like, do you want the shotgun to be useless? Do you not want it to be a one-shot kill at close range? Like, it's a shotgun. Of course it's going to be a one-shot kill at close range. That's just my view on that. When it comes to DMRs, I completely disagree with what appears to be the overwhelmingly common opinion that they are completely useless, particularly the EMR. I've been seeing a lot of people say that the EMR was just the most unusable weapon in the whole beta. And to those people, I simply say, you were using it completely wrong if you think that. I think the DMRs are busted. I genuinely think that they might be overpowered because of how fucking good they are, including the EMR. The EMR was incredibly good at medium to long range. People have been saying that the EMR has a lot of recoil. It doesn't. It has a lot of visual recoil, but the time between shots is so great that even when spamming it at maximum fire rate, it recenters after every shot. You can spam it at maximum fire rate and hit people at significantly long ranges. The speed at which you can kill people with the DMRs at range is insane. Now, I will mention, up close, the DMRs are useless, both of them. Both the EMR and the SVK, or whatever it was called, are useless up close. You have almost no chance of beating an AR or an SMG or an LMG or shotgun, whatever. But at range, they are unstoppable because of the spread mechanics and the time to kill of the full auto weapons. Nothing can touch you. Nothing has a chance of touching you. I got so many kills using the EMR and using the SVK on people that just didn't have a chance, because when you're going up against an AR, an SMG, a carbine, an LMG, a shotgun, which most people are going to be using, mind you, because those are the most popular weapon categories in any game. When your opponent is using any of those weapons and you come across them with a DMR at medium to long range, they have no chance. And this kind of plays into what I was talking about with map design, where it's like, yes, a lot of these maps were CQB oriented, CQB focused. So they didn't give the DMRs a bunch of opportunities to shine. But I still do feel like even on these CQB maps, there were areas that catered to longer sightlines that allowed the DMRs to shine. And I had lots of success using the DMRs on these maps. I think the DMRs are in a really good spot because they are really, really powerful. Really, like I said, borderline overpowered at range, but then they're really weak up close, which just specializes them for a particular play style, right? Which I think is perfect. You want there to be a separation between how the weapon categories operate, because that just makes them feel different. And that's a good thing, in my opinion. I think the DMRs were in a really good spot. Another thing I've been seeing, and this kind of goes in hand with the game being too fast-paced, is that the maps were too small. I really don't see how this is a valid criticism or complaint of the game, really, at all. I mean, we've played on 4 of the maps that are going to be in the launch. We know that there's going to be 9 maps at launch, and there's going to be lots of maps that are added post-launch, assumedly. I mean, assuming the game is successful, which it most likely will be. Really doesn't matter if a few of them are a little bit smaller. And honestly, I'm going to be honest here, I really didn't feel like the maps were too small in the first place. So I'm not even really going to give that any amount of validation. I thought these maps were really well sized, honestly. I wouldn't be opposed to the game having larger maps that support more vehicles and that sort of thing. But for infantry focused maps, which Battlefield has always had, these maps were really good size, in my opinion, and just really well designed. Like I said, I think that these maps really allowed a variety of play styles, which is a really good thing. So I personally didn't think the maps were too small. And even if you want to argue that they are, it's less than half of the maps we're going to have at the launch of the game. And they're going to constantly be adding more maps down the line. So it really doesn't matter at all. I've seen a few people talk about how visibility is bad, particularly when inside looking outside or outside looking inside. I don't know if HDR mode has anything to do with this. I was playing on Xbox with HDR, and I didn't really notice this issue at all, if I'm being completely honest. I have seen gameplay on YouTube of people demonstrating this issue, and it does seem like there is a pretty significant difference. So I guess this is more of a SDR issue. So I just personally can't really comment on that. But in HDR, I didn't really notice this problem at all. If this is a significant problem in SDR, then I agree that it probably should be changed. From the videos that I've seen, it has the potential to look pretty bad where, you know, if you're inside looking outside, it looks very blown out. And if you're outside looking inside, it looks very dark and crushed. So I can understand that that would be very annoying. But yeah, in HDR, I didn't notice this problem whatsoever. So I just can't really comment on that one. One of the last things here is the open weapons. I've seen a lot of people talking about how closed weapons played so much better than the open weapons playlist and that sort of thing. I completely disagree. I mean, I to the point where I don't even really want to bother touching on this that much. It made no difference. If you think that it made a difference, it's just confirmation bias. You wanted it to make a difference. It's placebo. You went into it expecting it to be better. And so when you played it, wow, look at that. It was better. There was no difference. And as someone that played both modes with an open mind, I played the closed weapon conquest, I played open weapon conquest. The two modes were exactly the same. I did not notice any significant change in the amount of teamwork that was on display in the closed weapons, because that's something that people talk about is like, oh, well, when the weapons are closed, people work together as a team more because they're playing their class more specifically. It's like, no, that didn't happen. People weren't reviving more. People weren't allowing me to revive them more. And I didn't see a particularly large increase in like weapon variety, which is another thing people talk about, how when you have open weapons, everybody's just going to be using the same gun. I didn't see that. I mean, I saw tons of people using tons of different weapons. And yes, there were weapons that were used more than others, but I mean, that makes sense considering that a lot of the people that I saw over the beta were level 1 accounts because there was people checking out the game for the very first time. So those people are already going to have, a much smaller selection of weapons to pick from. So it makes sense that those weapons would get used more than others anyway. Obviously, only time will tell when it comes to like the meta, quote unquote, of the game and how that, affects the gameplay long term. It's just a problem that I really don't care about much at all. As a player that always incorporates variety into my play style, I don't care. It doesn't affect me. If everybody else wants to use the same exact gun, so be it. I'll use a variety and I'll be happy. And that's all that I care about. The last thing I want to touch on is the spotting. I agree that spotting is bad. There were plenty of times when I was playing that I would not see a player model, but rather I would see the red diamond above them and just shoot in that direction. And I do think that that is bad. I do think that that prevents, a certain play style, and it also just makes the game a little bit less exciting in a way, kind of for everybody. I think it's less exciting to shoot at a red diamond rather than a player model, and it is less exciting to be shot because someone saw your red diamond and not, your player model. It does limit your ability to be stealthy. It limits your ability to pull off a flank. So I am not a huge fan of how spotting worked, especially with the recon class. They could just auto spot people as they aim down sight. That was extremely powerful and just a little bit annoying. There were a few times when I died where I can only assume that I was spotted and therefore I was killed just because I had a diamond above my head. It's just a little frustrating. So I am absolutely on board with them either toning down or just straight up removing the spotting mechanic. It's kind of the same problem. I've talked in the past about how much I dislike, mini maps in video games and how, shooting your weapon makes you a red dot on the mini map. I don't like that gameplay mechanic, and this is basically the same thing as that, if not even worse, because it's showing you exactly in real time in your vision where enemies are, and I just find that just less appealing. If they wanted to have a spotting mechanic in the game that puts a red diamond above your head, I do think it should be on some kind of button bind so that it's not just automatic. Like I said, with the recon class, all you have to do is aim down sights, and an enemy is like even relatively close to the center of your aim, they'll get spotted for your entire team. And there were plenty of times when I was playing as recon that, I would just aim in a certain direction and all of a sudden like 5 red diamonds would pop up on people that I didn't even see. I'm just really not into that whole gameplay mechanic, and I do think that that should be at the very least changed to some degree. But those are going to be my thoughts on the beta. Overall, I am incredibly hyped for the game. My experience with the beta was overwhelmingly positive. I will say that a lot of this video has been talking about, the neutral or negative aspects of the beta, but that just is because, those are the things that I want to point out so that there's a chance that they get changed, that sort of thing. Overall, though, absolutely, I had a blast. And looking at some of the recent leaks that have been coming out for the newest labs builds, it looks insane. I am incredibly excited to play the full release, and I just really can't wait until the game comes out. But anyway, if you played the beta or if you've just been following the progress of Battlefield 6, let me know what you think. Let me know what you thought of the beta, if you were having fun, if you weren't having fun, and maybe some of the things that you noticed that you would like to have changed. But anyway, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you later. Bye.